Peterson. Thank you. I'm very happy to see you too. Definitely. So, I thought I would go through a number of the rules mostly from my last book. But I'm going to start with one from the first book. People have asked me which of the rules, the 24 rules, I thought was most important. And I think it's probably the 8th rule from the first book. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. So, there's a famous scene in the gospel stories where Pontius Pilate, who's part of the Roman tyranny, an arrogant character, although perhaps not without his virtues in some ways, poses a question to Christ when he's interrogating him in this famous kind of nihilistic, cynical, skeptical question: what is truth? And people who are inclined to be tempted to believe that they're smarter than they are like to ask that question. But it is a difficult question. And that's actually why I formulated that particular rule in that manner. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Why like that? Well, we're all ignorant in the final analysis. No matter how much you know about anything, you can find the edge of your knowledge. You can find the place where you have nothing further to say. You can find where your ability to understand is grounded in a more fundamental ignorance. And what that means is that you can't exactly tell the truth, because what the hell do you know? You know, you run out of answers at some level. You might know enough to perform a certain operation effectively, and that's not a bad definition of what constitutes true enough. In fact, it isn't obvious to me that we can actually do better than that. Like, you know enough to stop asking yourself questions if, when you act out your knowledge, what you want to have happen, happens. That doesn't mean that you know everything. It doesn't even mean that you're right in some absolute sense. It doesn't mean that you can say with certainty what the truth is. But you cannot lie. Now, sometimes you might object, well, how do you know the difference between when you're lying and when you're telling the truth? And the answer to that is, well, I don't know exactly how you know the difference. Because to know that, I'd have to know how we think. And I would have to know the difference between truth and falsehood exhaustively. But I do know that I know when I'm lying sometimes. Right? So there may be times when you're formulating an argument or where you're performing an action where you're truly in doubt about whether or not you're in accordance with the truth. But there are other times you know perfectly well that what you're saying is false, or what you're doing is the equivalent of false, that they call that a performative contradiction, when you're acting out something you know to be a lie. It's not exactly a lie because you're not speaking, but you're acting in a false manner. And sometimes you know that incontrovertibly, and you do it anyways. And so what I suggested in that rule was that you could start by not doing that anymore. And what you might find this is what I found, and it's what my clients found, and I think my students too, that started to abide by this doctrine, was that as you practice not lying, you get better at distinguishing between what's true and what's false. And so I think that you can move with successive approximation to the truth by not lying, by restricting your domain of self-evident errors. Now then you might ask yourself, well, why the hell shouldn't I lie? Smarter kids lie younger. Well, why? Well, because a lie is kind of a magic trick, right? Because you can formulate a fictional world, 'cause that's what a lie is, right? It's a formulation of a representation of the world that's false. You can formulate a fictional representation of the world, and in principle, you can enforce that representation on the world, and as a consequence, you can escape from punishment, deserved or not, or you can get something that you didn't earn, or that's the theory. And of course, well, that's why you lie, right? I mean, why else would you possibly lie? You lie because you don't have to take responsibility for something you did. It's very common among children, right? If a child misbehaves and you call them on it, they'll come up with some story about the fact that they didn't do it, or some alternative explanation for their actions that justifies what they did. Go around to everyone on the ship and say, do you have something going on with God? Because this isn't going very well. And Jonah admits that he's the guy. And so they throw him off the ship. And the waves calm. And that's pretty good for the people on the ship, but it's not that great for Jonah, because now he's in the water and about to drown. And that's pretty rough. But that's not rough enough. And you might think, well, that should be rough enough because he's going to die. It's like, yeah, death isn't the worst thing. Death, knowledge of impending death, followed by death, isn't the worst thing. And that's a frightening thing to contemplate. And so what happens to Jonah is a whale comes up from the depths and swallows him. Now that's another one of those occurrences that allows the cocky rationalist to say, well, yeah, a giant fish can't swallow a man. There's no room inside a whale. It's like, kudos to you, buddy, for being perspicacious enough to figure that out. It's like, it's not a sign of genius, and the fact that you think that ancient people were foolish enough to believe that just means that you think that just because you're born now, you're wiser than the people who were born 3,000 years ago. And there may be some things you know that they didn't, but there were lots of things they knew that you didn't. And it isn't obvious at all that the sorry spectacles that we present today are in any way morally superior to the people who, lived in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. It's very nice for us to think that because it's easy moral virtue, but those were tough people, man. And they dealt with difficulties that we can't even begin to imagine in our sort of secure and materially satiated, infantilizing environment. And so Jonah's swallowed by a whale. What does that mean? Well, you've seen the movie Pinocchio, right? And Geppetto ends up inside a whale at the bottom of the ocean, and it's kind of hell. It's the underworld. You can tell it's hell in part because in the Pinocchio movie, the interior of the whale starts to light on fire. I mean, Pinocchio does that, but there's an association between the whale and fire, which makes the whale into a dragon, and there's an association between that and the abyss. Pinocchio has to go right down to the bottom of the ocean to find this whale monstro that's swallowed up his father. And there's a notion that things can descend, even things of value can descend into something like hell, the abyss, right? And that's what happens to Jonah. And so what does that mean in your life? Well, it means that if you fail to say what you're called upon to say, that the storms will rise, that your fellow voyagers will throw you into the abyss, that the worst thing you could possibly imagine will take hold of you and take you to the very bottom of reality itself. And so that might be easier on you than just going to Nineveh and saying what you have to say, but arguably it's worse. And so, people have commented to me, it isn't a comment that I believe is accurate. They, compliment me on my bravery. It's so brave of you to speak up. It's like, you don't understand. I'm not brave. I'm just afraid of the right thing. And so you can be afraid of the inhabitants of the city of Nineveh, or you can be unwilling to be thrown into the ocean and dragged down into the abyss. He's had to go through to straighten it out. Then he thinks God should just, smite them a good one and be done with it. And they have another scrap, by the way, where Jonah calls out God on his unwillingness to demolish the inhabitants of Nineveh. But God convinces him that a little mercy in this situation, despite the iniquity of the citizens of the city, was in order. And Jonah comes to agree. Because if the merciful path can be taken, it's better than the path of judgment. If it can be taken. So Jonah, he lies, avoids his responsibility, and dooms himself. But he dooms the city as well. And so, you've got to ask yourself, this is a reasonable question. In principle, you're made in the image of God, right? In principle, there's something of intrinsic value that characterizes you. And you may have your doubts about that, but I would say, well, first of all, the society that you live in, this wonderful free society that you people have established in the United States, is predicated on the idea that you do in fact have that intrinsic value, and that the law itself must, and the state must take that value into account, and to the degree that you treat yourself and other people properly and in the manner that would entice them to want to continue associating with you, you treat them as if they're intrinsic loci of value. And you might say, well, what does that value constitute? And you could say, well, it constitutes what you have to offer to the world. And there isn't anyone else who's like you, and there never will be. You're like a one-shot deal. And what that means is that you have something to put forward into the world that will not be put forward in the world in any other manner. And what that means is that if you don't put that forward, then you deprive the world, yourself certainly, but also the world of whatever that unique contribution is. And you have no idea how important that is. It might be crucial, certainly crucial in Socrates' case, and you might say, well, I'm no Socrates. It's like, fair enough, but who the hell knows who you are? Or what you would be if you actually lived in the truth. Now that's a hell of a thing to ask, but the alternative's a hell of a thing too. So you can pick your misery. So why pick the truth? Well, the story of Jonah provides one answer. The truth is that which redeems the sinful city. Avoiding the truth dooms the individual and the city. That's a pretty good answer. But it's not the only answer, Here's another one. It's got two variants. So, one thing you might ask yourself is, just exactly who are you when you're lying? And you might think, well, you're you. It's like, well, no, you're not, because what you're doing is false. So whatever it is that you are when you're lying, it's not you by definition, because it's not true. It's not a true manifestation of who you are. So it's something else, or someone else. The mythological representation of the spirit of deception is Luciferian, essentially. There's a notion, a very well-developed notion that is aggregated across thousands of years, that the spirit that lies has a nature, right? And you know the nature of the spirit that lies, who lies, because you see it portrayed constantly, you know. You see it in the Joker, in the figure of the Joker in the Batman series, for example, or you see it in Lex Luthor, who's Superman's alter ego, or you see it in the figure of Draco or Lucius Malfoy, or in the background, Voldemort. You see it in the figure of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. You see it in Scar in The Lion King, and Lampwick in Pinocchio, and Vector in Despicable Me, and so forth and so on. That the spirit that lies is a coherent personality who is oriented against the world. And when you lie, that's the spirit that's speaking. And you might say, well, I'm going to ally myself with that spirit for the purpose of short-term convenience. But I would say, you should be careful who you climb in bed with. And so that's worth thinking about. Because if it isn't you speaking, it's something else speaking. And if it isn't you speaking to something else that's speaking, might not have your best interest in mind. And you think, well, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, that's pride too. Because your claim is basically this: I can twist the fabric of reality to suit my own short-term purposes. And that's quite the bloody claim already, that you can twist and bend the fabric of reality itself, that you have that capability, that no one will notice, you or your fellow humans, and that will somehow readjust the manner in which the cosmos manifests itself to your benefit, and you'll get away with it. Yeah, I don't think so. It's not a very good plan. It's not a very wise plan. It's highly improbable that that's how it will work out. Interview situations. And so far, I haven't been caught in any poisonous snare in a manner that's fatal. And you might say, well, why is that? And one answer is, I had a lot of clinical experience. And the probability that the journalist who's interviewing me can bring out snakes that I haven't seen before is very low. And so it's frequently the case when I'm talking to a journalist, especially if they're female and British, that that I think, oh, I thought we were having an interview, but you're actually a snake. And so, but I know how to talk to snakes, so let's just see how this goes. And then you might say, well, how do you talk to snakes? That's Harry Potter's question, right? How do you speak the language of snakes? And the answer to that is, you just say what you think. And you let go of that outcome. If you go into an interview like that, any situation like that, and you want to manipulate that so that you'll get whatever you think you should get, you know, that you'll look more intelligent than the interviewer, that you'll attract viewers to sell books, let's say, or in the case of a job interview, that you'll get a job that you don't deserve. If you've got some concept of the end in mind that the impulsive and manipulative part of yourself wants, then you'll gerrymander the conversation. And if you're doing that when you're talking to a snake that's more venomous than you will be in some serious trouble. And that's worth thinking about too, because there will come a time in your life where you're actually confronted by something that's pretty damn dangerous and malevolent, and you're going to want to know how to conduct yourself in that situation. Because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. One of the things I definitely learned about dealing with dangerous people, dangerous paranoid people, is you don't lie to them. Because they're better at it than you. They'll figure it out. And they're probably not that positively inclined to you to begin with. But if then they think that you're a lying and cheating manipulator, it's like whatever minimal inhibitions they have that were holding them back in their malevolence, those are pretty much gone. So what do you do instead in a tricky situation? And life is a tricky situation. It's like, well, how about you just say what you think? Carefully, if you can. No more emotion than necessary, if you can. No more force than necessary if you're wise. But there's no sense making unnecessary enemies. But you could say what you have to say. You could speak your being forth. You could find out who you are that way, even because you reveal that to yourself while you're speaking. And you put your best foot forward in that manner, which is a good thing to do when you're on dangerous ground. And then you might say, well, how do you have to think in order to do that? And here's the answer to that. This is an article of faith. Here's two possibilities. The world that I bring forward as a consequence of using deception is preferable to the world that would come forth if I didn't use deception. Right? That's a statement of faith. If I lied, I could get away with it and things would be better for me. Now you have no evidence of that. It's a principle, and you can move forward with that. And then you're going to lie and manipulate and cheat and deceive to get what you want. The problem with that, we've laid out. What the hell do you know? Here's an alternative proposition. Whatever happens when you tell the truth is the best thing that could possibly happen, even if you can't see why. Right? And that's a proposition. The proposition is the truth itself brings the best possible world into being. And you might say, well, yeah, but I pay a price for telling the truth. It's like, yeah, but you pay a price for not telling the truth too. And we already outlined the price. The price is the waves rise and the great serpent of the abyss takes you in its jaws and brings you to hell. That doesn't seem like such a good outcome. Or you speak in the voice of something that's not you, and then you don't even have your life. And you miss the adventure of your life. That seems like a bad deal. And so what's the relationship between truth and adventure? Well, here's the relationship. First of all, if you're saying what you have to say, it's you speaking. So whatever happens to you is happening to you. It's your thing. It's not something that's happening to the spirit of falsehood. It's happening to you. And you might say, well, that's not necessarily so good. It's like, well, it depends on what you compare it with. But here's the thing. There's something extraordinarily exciting about letting go of the outcome. Because you don't know what's going to happen. We already said that, like, if you want to have an adventure, you want to have a certain degree of novelty associated with that, right? You don't want to fall into some dismal, dull, stultifying, static routine where, because you've calculated and connived so perfectly that only exactly what you want to have happen is happening. It's like, you don't want that. You want some spark. You know, Dostoevsky said in Notes from Underground, when he was talking about prideful, intellectual, utopian speculations, that if you gave the typical person, meaning any of us, exactly what they wanted, so what did Dostoevsky say? They had nothing to do. You had nothing to do but eat cake, sit in pools of warm water, and busy yourself with the continuation of the species, right? That the first thing you do is break it all to pieces just so something strange and interesting could happen. So that's what makes a human being, is that we're capable of that sort of ingratitude. You know, even in paradise, we had to mess with the snake. It's the rationale for Rule 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Thank you very much.